Hello, I'm Josh Cunnings with EnviroNews USA, and welcome to another episode of Outside the Box. Tonight, as we predicted, the U.S. Congress has passed Senate Bill 1867 in a 283 to 136 vote. SB 1867, now House Resolution 1540, was later modified by the Armed Services Committee in response to President Obama's threat of a veto. It now appears that Obama will sign a bill into law that has been called the most traitorous act in the history of the U.S. Senate, despite an outpouring of opposition from Democrats and Republicans alike, as well as the directors of the Justice Department, the FBI, and the CIA. Now, only the President can stop SB 1867/HR 1540, hailed as a butchering of the Bill of Rights, from becoming legal code. Sadly, he has indicated that he intends to sign the frivolously modified version into law. Obama had originally threatened a veto of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, but has now said he intends to sign off on House Resolution 1540, the newly modified edition of the bill that came out of a special and secretive closed-door Armed Services Committee meeting. There has been a train of thought out there by certain legislators that these amendments actually did fix the problems pertaining to indefinite detention of American citizens, but opponents of the act fervently disagreed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a decade since the attacks of September 11, 2001. We are in danger of losing our most precious heritage, not because a band of thugs threatens our freedom, but because we are at risk of forgetting who we are and what makes the United States a truly great nation. In the last 10 years, we have begun to let go of our freedoms, bit by bit, with each new executive order, court decision, and yes, act of Congress. The changes in this bill to the laws of detention have major implications for our fundamental rights. We should not be considering this as a rider to the Defense Authorization Bill. This should have been the subject of close scrutiny by the Judiciary Committee. The complex legal and constitutional issues should have been properly analyzed and the implications for our values carefully considered. You will hear that this bill merely recodifies existing law, but many legal scholars tell us it goes a great deal further than what the law now allows, that it codifies claims of executive power against our liberties that the courts have never confirmed. You will hear that it really won't affect U.S. citizens, although again, there is credible legal authority that tells us just the opposite. You will hear that it doesn't really turn the military into a domestic police force, but that clearly isn't the case. Most of all, you will hear that we must do this to be safe, when the opposite is true. We can never be safe without our liberties, and this bill continues the decade-long campaign to destroy those liberties. Whoever it reaches, the government would have the authority to lock them up without trial until, quote, the end of hostilities, unquote, which, given how broadly the AUMF has been used to justify actions far from Afghanistan, might mean forever. And who will be taken out of the civilian justice system and imprisoned forever without a trial? The bill says anyone who, quote, is determined, unquote, to be covered by the statute. It doesn't say determined by whom or what protections there are to ensure that an innocent person doesn't disappear into a military prison. That's not America. We also need to be clear that the so-called Feinstein Amendment does not really provide the protection its sponsor intended to provide. When the Feinstein Amendment references existing law, you should not assume that means the current law clearly deprives the president of this dangerous power. I hope it does, but it is still legally an open question. We should ensure that our liberty is protected and not leave that question to some future court. And we should certainly not enact a law codifying. And that's what this law does. It codifies, it puts into law terrifying claims of power made by presidents, but never approved by the courts, or until now, by the Congress. And that's the fundamental reason we should reject this bill. We must take great care. Our liberties are too precious to be cast aside in times of peril and fear.
In reviewing the amendment that has now earned the President's pledge for a stamp of approval, we found nothing that would salvage the posse comitatus from utter destruction, nor did we find anything that they would exclude from or grant immunity to U.S. citizens in the detainee provisions. Instead, what we encountered was carefully crafted language that would still definitively allow for the use of military power against U.S. citizens on non-federal lands without any due process or rights to a jury trial. Despite the fact that the Armed Services Committee modified the bill to address the president's concerns, opponents of the legislation say that much of the provisional language contained within is convoluted, sneaky, and broad-reaching to include American citizens. Here's Raha Walla on Current TV.
Here's what the legislation says. It says that if you are suspected of being a member of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or a quote-unquote associated force, whatever that means, then you can be held indefinitely without trial, whether you're an American citizen or not, whether you're captured within the United States or not. And it goes further than that. What it says is that if you're suspected of supporting the Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, you can also be held.
Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio had this to say.
This legislation authorizes the military to indefinitely detain individuals without charge or trial, including the detention of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. In short, what this bill does is it takes a wrecking ball to the United States Constitution and gives enormous power to the government or the state. It's the wrong direction.
What makes the passage of this soon-to-be law an even more brazen power grab is the unbelievable fact that it was ramrodded through Congress on the very night of the 220th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights itself. They are spitting directly into the faces of the Founding Fathers. Furthermore, they passed it in the waning hours of the 2011 legislative session amidst all of the hustling and bustling melee of the holiday season. Merry Christmas, America. Martial law gift-wrapped with a red ribbon of deception and lies. This hideous annihilation of our rights was blatantly herded through Congress during the season of Yuletide and charity, and with the complicity of a near-total mainstream media blackout. It was written in such a convoluted fashion that the secretly crafted Armed Services Committee amendment itself came out both confusing and contradictory in its very nature, not to mention loaded with grammatical errors that are beneath those of a junior high school student. Despite the mainstream media's mysterious unwillingness to talk about one of the most monumental and pivotal stories of the last century, we were able to find this compelling Fox News segment on Freedom Watch with Judge Andrew Napolitano. Here's what they had to say over at Fox.
Big government Republicans and Democrats were busy shredding the last vestiges of the Constitution. Senators John McCain and Carl Levin want to enact a law that would declare the entire United States of America a battlefield for the military. They're talking about inserting the Army into domestic law enforcement. Senator Lindsey Graham, who supports this bill, says, quote, "The homeland is part of the battlefield, and people can be held without trial, whether an American citizen or not." I guess he hasn't read the Constitution recently. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor joins us now. Colonel McGregor, as always, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks, Judge.
I must tell you, I was utterly appalled when I saw this legislation proposed. We didn't learn about it until last night because the committee hearings on it were done in secret, even though the Constitution requires the Congress to do these things in public. And there were no actual hearings, just a bunch of members of the Senate who got together and wrote this thing. And it basically says the president can arrest whoever he wants anywhere in the United States of America and keep them without charging them with a crime, without letting them see a lawyer, without bringing them to a judge for as long as he wants. How is that consistent with the Constitution?
Well, Judge, you're the legal expert, but whenever you suspend due process, which in effect suspends the rule of law, you walk down a very dangerous path and you give authority to your government that it can then wield essentially without restraint. What worries me is that we'll end up creating categories of people who are then subject to arbitrary arrest. And that's dangerous because we don't know how those categories will be defined or interpreted in the future. All in all, it's a disaster and it's something that should be defeated.
One day the President of the United States, whomever he or she might be, might say, okay, let's arrest that guy.
Suppose the president decided that one of his political opponents was an enemy of the state. He could make that person disappear. Sounds fanciful, sounds crazy, but it's true.
Since the devastating attacks of 9/11, we have not apprehended a single terrorist on U.S. soil. Not to mention, President Obama has been far more successful than Bush ever hoped to be in combating terrorism in the first place, having already killed or apprehended 22 of the top 30 al-Qaeda leaders since taking office. So why now? Why this enhanced policy that destroys the Posse Comitatus Act of 1876 and designates the U.S. as a battlefield, allowing our own military to capture, detain, interrogate, and even assassinate anyone they deem as a terrorist threat without due process or trial by jury? We can't help but to observe the striking correlation and impeccable timing between this bill, a bill that accomplishes the effective installation of a police state in our country, and the flourishing Occupy movement now running wild in nearly every sector of society. It would seem our own government is now granting themselves a legal hall pass to use the U.S. military, our military, against anyone they deem as a threat with total impunity. Another amazing aspect to this entire process is the fact that Rand Paul, a very conservative senator from the state of Kentucky that comes from a background and, quite frankly, a childhood that is filled with a strict constitutionalism, introduced a cut and dry amendment that would have simply excluded American citizens from the indefinite detention provisions contained within the bill. And to our astonishment, Rand Paul's amendment was comfortably voted down on the Senate floor. A nice attempt by the senator from Kentucky to save all of our constitutional liberties, but apparently not good enough. Here's Rand Paul going head-to-head with John McCain, one of the two authors of the controversial language contained within the bill, on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
My question would be, under the provisions, would it be possible that an American citizen then could be declared an enemy combatant and sent to Guantanamo Bay and detained indefinitely?
I think that as long as that individual, no matter who they are, if they pose a threat to the security of the United States of America, should not be allowed to continue that threat. And I think that's the majority of American public opinion, especially in light of the facts that I continue to repeat to the senator from Kentucky.
And here's what Shane Cadidal of the Center for Constitutional Rights had to say.
Shane Cadidal of the Center for Constitutional Rights says the vague wording of the bill opens the door to activists being treated as terrorists.
What does it mean to substantially support an associated force of al-Qaeda? It could mean anything the government wants it to mean. You know, some activist doing a press release, that counts as support for a group of other activists, and it turns out that somebody in that group has some link to someone the U.S. says is in a group that's linked to al-Qaeda. Well, you can see how easily this sort of thing can spin out of control.
Here's a segment on KPFA Radio in Berkeley, California, featuring Shahid Butara.
Some legal experts, including Shahid Buttar of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, says the bill would likely get challenged in court if it becomes law. But Buttar isn't optimistic about the outcome, given that U.S. courts have a tendency to let laws related to national security stand. He cited the cases on Bush-era warrantless wiretapping and torture as examples.
I think we generally rely, to our detriment, entirely too much on courts that have proven themselves time and time again either unwilling or unable to check and balance executive power in the interest of protecting the constitutional rights that are their responsibility.
Buttar also noted the timing of the legislation.
This very day, Thursday, December 15th, happens to be the 220th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. It is profoundly ironic, to say the least, that it would be today that the U.S. Senate would essentially sign the death warrant for the First Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment, and the Posse Comitatus Act, the separation of powers. I mean, this bill is a jurisprudential earthquake that has essentially proceeded in secret.
If you thought this bill wasn't bad enough, hardly anyone, with the exception of Ron Paul, is even talking about the language that appears in Section 1034, advancing us with one tyrannical leap into the abyss of Nazi-era fiefdom. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. In one fell swoop, we are now the Commonwealth democracy that was, having effectively traversed at the helm of a few corporate oligarchs from freedom to fiefdom. Here's Ron Paul.
There is no denial that the changes in Section 1034 totally eliminates the hard-fought-for restraint on presidential authority to go to war without congressional approval achieved at the Constitutional Convention.
And now let's take a look at Democratic Senator Carl Levin, co-author of SB 1867's most ominous provisions, as he engages in a childish, fist-thumping power tantrum on Capitol Hill.
One line. There is no bar to this nation's holding one of its own citizens as an enemy combatant. Okay?
Okay, what happens if you're the guy they decide is the enemy combatant, Senator?
Now, the sad hard fact is, only President Obama himself can stop this doomsday legislation from destroying over 220 years of America's liberty. But the most horrifying thing of all is that in our research, we have found evidence that suggests that the President himself has no intention of stopping these unjust provisions, but rather has been behind them, nurturing and fostering their very manifestation all along. I know it sounds almost impossible to believe, but when we dug deeper and deeper into this issue, we were shocked and even heartbroken to find that apparently this sinister plot of the unconstitutional demise and appalling crucifixion of the Bill of Rights has come straight from the Oval Office itself. Here is President Barack Obama speaking out in a historic speech nearly 1 year ago, right in front of the Constitution of the United States, making a virtual mockery of Lady Liberty herself, via the Rachel Maddow Show on MSNBC.
Standing inside the National Archives in front of the actual original Constitution, President Obama delivered a blistering critique of the Bush administration, in which he called their actions and their legacy literally a mess.
Al-Qaeda terrorists and their affiliates are at war with the United States, and those that we capture, like other prisoners of war, must be prevented from attacking us again.
Prevented. We will incarcerate people preventively. Preventive incarceration. Indefinite detention without trial. That's what this is. That's what President Obama proposed today, if you strip away the euphemisms. One civil liberties advocate told the New York Times today, quote, "We've known this was on the horizon for many years, but we were able to hold it off with George Bush. The idea that we might find ourselves fighting with the Obama administration over these powers is really stunning." And it is stunning, particularly to hear President Obama claim the power to keep people in prison indefinitely with no charges against them, no conviction, no sentence, just imprisonment. It's particularly stunning to hear him make that claim in the middle of a speech that was all about the rule of law.
But we must do so with an abiding confidence in the rule of law. Our government was defending positions that undermine the rule of law to ensure that they are in line with the rule of law.
How can a president speak the kind of poetry that President Obama does about the rule of law and call for the power to indefinitely, preventively imprison people because they might commit crimes in the future? How can those two things coexist in the same man, even in the same speech? Well, that brings us to the self-consciously awkward, embarrassing part of this speech today. After condemning the Bush administration for what he called their ad hoc legal strategy for trying to make things seem legal that patently weren't, this is what President Obama proposed.
My administration has begun to reshape the standards that apply to ensure that they are in line with the rule of law. We must have clear, defensible, and lawful standards for those who fall into this category. We must have a thorough process of periodic review so that any prolonged detention is carefully evaluated and justified. Our goal is to construct a legitimate legal framework for the remaining Guantanamo detainees that cannot be transferred. Our goal is not to avoid a legitimate legal framework. In our constitutional system, prolonged detention should not be the decision of any one man. If and when we determine that the United States must hold individuals to keep them from carrying out an act of war, we will do so within a system that involves judicial and congressional oversight. And so going forward, my administration will work with Congress to develop an appropriate legal regime so that our efforts are consistent with our values and our Constitution.
You'll construct a legal regime to make indefinite detention legal. You will, what does he say? Develop an appropriate legal regime. So you can construct a whole new system outside the courts, even outside the military commissions, so that you can indefinitely imprison people without charges. And you'll build that system from scratch.
And so going forward, my administration will work with Congress to develop an appropriate legal regime. And so going forward, my administration will work with Congress to develop an appropriate legal regime,
Prolonged detention, he's calling it. This was a beautiful speech from President Obama today with patriotic, moving, even poetic language about the rule of law and the Constitution, and one of the most radical proposals for defying the Constitution that we have ever heard made to the American people.
If you thought this story couldn't get any more unbelievable, it actually does. And you can start to see all the pieces of the puzzle coming together. Buckling under the pressure from his comrades, Senator Carl Levin has even resorted to levels that are unacceptable within the ranks of a crime syndicate. This is huge. Let's watch.
Who actually asked for the ability to arrest U.S. citizens and hold them without trial? Watch.
Ask us to remove the language which says that U.S. citizens and lawful residents would not be subject to this section. Is the senator familiar with the fact that it was the administration that asked us to remove the very language which we had in the bill which passed the committee, and that we removed it at the request of the administration, that would have said that this determination would not apply to U.S. citizens and lawful residents?
That's right, folks. Under the scrutiny of his own crony accomplices, Senator Carl Levin, a Democrat, has now turned around and snitched on his own president, pointing the finger right back at the White House for the dastardly language contained within the bill. The baffling realization that this sort of orchestrated assault could come directly from the executive branch of government is absolutely stupefying. As we relate this sad state of affairs to you this evening, it seems as though the perverted powers that be are already practicing their newfound craft of the annihilation of freedom. As a U.S. soldier himself is currently facing life imprisonment for what many are calling a truth-revealing act of heroism, Private First Class Bradley Manning sits in captivity as we speak, awaiting his fate in a monumental WikiLeaks case. I guess this is change we can believe in. For EnviroNews USA, I'm Josh Cunnings. Good night.